There's one category of disorder which has resisted elucidation and which has resisted treatment. And that's why I would like to address it. It is now known as dissociative identity disorder. The name keeps changing in function of the addition of DSM-1 deals with. And it's called dissociative identity disorder to really, it's a euphemism to try to avoid addressing the main issues, which is that the person simply claims to be somebody else. And doesn't just claim to be somebody else, behaves like somebody else, has somebody else's memories, speaks like somebody else. There are physiological changes, there are changes sometimes in eyesight. Then, these cases obviously must be accounted for. Now, what are, according to DSM-4, which is the Bible, DSM-5 has just come out, my apologies, I couldn't justify spending $130 on it. So I had to go out the previous edition. What are the features of DID according to DSM-4? This is the orthodox psychiatric viewpoint. Two or more distinct identities are present in the individual. These identities take over control of the behavior of the character. They alter. They're never present together. The individual is unable to recall important personal information. It's like there is a split in the mind of these two boxes. And this disturbance is not due to drug usage or an underlying medical condition, let's say such as diabetes, which can cause mental problems. Now what is very interesting is if we rely on the patient's report, which is interestingly enough is systematically evacuated in these cases. The patient reports being somebody else. And these reports, as Kerry points out, involve what appears to be separate memory chains, streams of consciousness and identity, and display all the characteristics we attribute to conscious beings, such as memory, intention, volition, and creativity. Then, is psychiatry justified in considering that something has not entered the person? In the face of what looks like quite strong reported evidence that this has happened. These cases have become quite prevalent in Europe, largely due to immigration, and we encounter cases of possession by genes, both in the UK and in France. Quite common. Genes, as you know, are Islamic spirits which haunt the graveyards. This is a Muslim immigrant to the UK who is perfectly functional in daily life until the jinn possesses him. This has been going on for years. At which point he behaves in possession a bit like a snake. He hisses. Then he went to see a psychiatrist in the UK to no avail. He was told he suffered from high levels of anxiety, which don't really seem to represent what is happening. And finally appealed to a Quranic healer who seems to have been of some benefit. When possessed, he has no memories of his daily life. He was, I think, in a taxi center. And when he's in a taxi center, he has no memories of what happens when he is possessed. It's as if there are two different strains of consciousness. Then, what are the features of these cases of DID? And this is once again, broadly speaking, drawn from DSM-4. Headaches, change in voice, conversion symptoms, which means physical manifestations. It's a euphemism for psychosomatic manifestations. Changes in vision. There are cases of people who had presbycia, who, when they are possessed by a young child, lose this presbycia. Insensitivity to pain, seizure, differences in the EEG alpha rhythm, and change in handedness. Someone who is right-handed becomes left-handed, someone who is left-handed becomes right-handed. These amount to very important changes. Some of the most puzzling are the changes possession someone who needed glasses no longer needs them, and reciprocally. There's a very interesting study in your bibliography by Miller in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. I encourage you to read it. Adult personalities show presbyopia, child personalities never do. So, at best, this implies a degree of control over the human body which is very difficult to understand. Really, there's no mechanism proposed. I mean, I'm sure ophthalmologists would be thrilled, or perhaps they would be devastated, if it would be possible to heal presbyopia without glasses. It would probably destroy the profession. Now, what is interesting, and this is something which I would like to quote from a Bethany Brandon a survey of practices and recommended treatment intervention by expert therapists treating patients with dissociative identity disorder and dissociative disorder not otherwise specified. Those are the main textbooks of the treatment of DID. DID is basically very difficult, if not impossible. And this is the official view of the topic. So here we have a situation where the report of the patient says that something else is with him. Exterior evidence from observers seems to indicate indeed that we are dealing with two persons. Actually, DSM-4 speaks of two personalities. We are unable to treat this, but in what amounts to a dogmatic stance, we assert that the traditional explanation, which is adopted basically by everybody, except modern Westerners in the last 2 centuries, is wrong. Now, I didn't quote, I was going to bring it up, but it's perhaps stretching things for you a bit. A very interesting report by a Turkish psychiatrist who had to handle cases, DID cases, in present Kurdistan, part of Turkey, which is claimed by the Kurds, with almost no success, and systematically referred the cases to an Islamic healer, whom he said had a far higher success rate than he did. This raises a lot of questions. And Evan Haraldsson, who is one of Stevenson's colleagues, points out that when older personalities, in other words, these other persons, whether they are actually separate entities or not, are interrogated, about whom they believe they say they are children, helping spirits, demons, another living person, or dead relatives. And Evanson points out, even though the majority of artists claim not to belong to the individual, the prevailing opinion is that these are in fact parts of the individual. So here we have a case where I would say psychiatry, perhaps for dogmatic reasons, is flying in the face of an awful lot of evidence. And there have been psychiatrists who have broken off with the orthodox dogma. Many French psychiatrists who were directly in contact with DID cases in Africa, often disciples of the great French anthropologist Henri Mauss. So the initiator of this school of psychiatry, ethnopsychiatry, was the director of the department of psychiatry at Dakar, the hospital, Professor Henri Colomb, who was repeatedly faced with cases which at the period were called multiple personality disorder, now we're called DID, and was unable to treat them, and noticed that the native healers had good results. And put himself to the school of the native healers, figuring after all, as a working psychiatrist, what counts ultimately is healing the patient. And his disciples, Georges Devreux and Thomas Nathan, have continued this approach in France, where there is a very large number of African immigrants, and these problems are extremely widespread. Then Thomas Nathan, who is the foremost psychiatrist who integrates what amounts to exorcism in his psychiatric practice, gives one case. I remember Nadine, a lady from Cameroon, who underwent such a serious depression that she was unable to take care of her child. This is in Paris. I spoke to her, touching her hands with reassuring gestures. She entered at once into trance and declared in a man's voice, actually her father's voice, he had passed on 1 year earlier. I want Nadine to come at once to my grave in Cameroon. Then turning to me, he said, just who are you to speak to me? He then added, how can you take care of my daughter when you aren't even black? In this type of case, Dominata says there are only two solutions. Either one stops the therapeutic session, or one starts negotiating with the spirit who has appeared. It's a later option, actually. Then, obviously, if you're a working psychiatrist in a case like this, you have to work with the case. You can't just say to the patient, look, your stance is completely at odds with the DSM-4. I'd like you to review your position. And this actually has led some neurobiologists to investigate the neurobiology of possession. It's mainly Patrick McNamara at Boston Hospital and Andrew Newberg at the Berlin Center for Integrative Medicine, Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. Then, one of the most interesting studies I have seen on the topic is a study by Brazilian psychiatrists of spirit mediums who practice automatic writing, which I'm sure you have heard about. Now, normally these are cases which would be considered cases of dissociative identity disorder. You'd expect a typical pattern which modern psychiatry tells us leads to dissociative identity disorder, which is sexual abuse. Officially, it is this trauma during early childhood which leads to the appearance of a crypto personality which eventually takes over. And this is, I would say, current dogma. Then they found, basically, that among the 115 spirit mediums they studied, these subjects really did not fit the paradigm. They had a high educational level, they had low levels of psychiatric disorder, they were well adjusted socially. Only in one case did they score highly on borderline personality disorder. And in a subset of 10 cases which were studied, what you can basically see is that the educational level is quite high. These tend to be people who were full-time employed, retired or part-time employed, in other words, people who are able to function in society. Older people, frequently, and what is quite interesting, people who rated very low on the borderline personality disorder of the DSM-4. There was only one case where the personality rated highly and had suffered child abuse. Then this is quite puzzling. Moreover, the quality of the writing produced was very high. And they did not publish the charts, I did not have access to them, but the writing produced in the experienced quote-unquote spirit mediums did not involve the activation of the parts of the brain one would expect to see activated, as is the Brocaria and so forth. Then, as the authors of the study, Julio Fernando Perez and Alexander Moreira Almeida mentioned, the subjects produced complex content in a trans-dissociative state. There was underactivation of the brain areas specifically related to the cognitive processing being carried out. This is very difficult to account for. The quality of the writing is assessed as good by independent university examiners working in double-blind situations. In other words, they don't know who is basically giving them the text. Is it a spirit medium or just a student? You have spirit mediums who are rating very low on borderline personality disorder. Only one case of sexual abuse in borderline personality disorder. Well educated, generally university degrees, seem well integrated in society. It doesn't fit the paradigm at all. And the subject systematically attributed their work to spirits. So the self-description, the description of the event from the standpoint of the subjects suppose that somebody else can take care of it. And this leads me to one verified case of possession studied by Stevenson. I had to pry him for this. Because otherwise you're going to state an advanced shock. There's not a lot because it's rare. It's obviously very taboo with the societies in which it happens. The first thing typically when there's a case of Bharakaya possession in India is that one calls in an exorcist and tries to get it out of the way and nobody ever talks about it. Because the family basically is ostracized as a result. But Stevenson was able to investigate one case. And I wanted to show you a picture here, a series of pictures. I've shown previously of the possession of an African woman in Ghana by the spirit of a python, a snake spirit. Now, you may or may not know that the favorite food of pythons is eggs. And I encourage you to look at the face of this African lady devouring that egg with her eyes. It's quite astonishing. Whether or not a python spirit is present with her within her, I cannot say. But she's certainly making a very good case of impersonation. These are the cases Henri Coulon had to handle at Dakar Hospital. You cannot handle this on a day-to-day basis without revising your paradigm somewhat. Now, the case I'd like to cover with you is the case of Sumitra Singh, an Indian girl who, this is in an Indian village, right? Not in a Western hospital, showed exterior signs of death on July 19, 1985. She revived a couple of minutes later, and to the shock of her family, said that she was someone else. She said her name was Shiva Divedi, and that she had been murdered. She did not recognize her family, but when introduced to them, recognized 13 members of Shiva Divedi's family. And what is most puzzling is that her behavior changed completely. She was a simple village girl before the apparent death. There was no indication. After the apparent death, she spoke a high level of Hindi and behaved like an urbanite, which Shiva Divedi had turned out to be. She had a bachelor's degree. The case was investigated by Stevenson. He interrogated the parties in presence. So during her death, she was described, and again this is a description based on the observation of villagers, as pulseless, there is no pulse, and apneic, no breathing, and her face was drained of blood. Keep in mind, however, these are people who have seen a lot of death, much more than you or I probably ever would. After her revival, she behaved like a different person. And she clearly stated she had been murdered by her in-laws, which is quite common in India. She could not recognize the people around her. When her father came, she refused to recognize him, and more embarrassingly, refused to have anything to do with her husband or her child. She said, literally, you are not my husband. Now, if we compare the two cases, Sumitra Singh was born in 1968. She was born in a lower middle class, a Thakur caste, lower class person, peasant background. She had basically not attended school. I think she had attended a couple of years of kindergarten. The statement she never went to school is not quite correct. Then, the possessing personality, Shiva Divedi, died in 1985. She was of the highest caste, the Brahmin caste, middle class, and urban. These are huge distinctions in India. It's not a Western country. Someone who lives in a village and someone who lives in a city evolve in two different universes. Shiva Divedi was highly articulate and literate in Hindi. She had a BA degree, and she claimed she was murdered by her in-laws. I think they actually took her to a railway track and tied her down on the railway track or something of that nature. Then Sumitra's recognition after possession of members of Shiva Divedi's family. She recognized herself in the picture. She knew Shiva's father's pet names. She recognized her maternal uncle. She knew the name of her maternal uncle, and she even knew the name and the nickname of a childhood friend. Then this case bears striking resemblance to the cases of reincarnation type. The only difference is that you have incarnation during the life of the person or just after an apparent death. There is, in my personal opinion, no difference in kind between these cases, but a difference of degree. Stevenson does not have a lot of such cases, but the ones he has are well verified. Then, if we are ready to accept the notion of a non-material consciousness, and I hope to have given you quite a lot of arguments in favor of that, there's no particular reason we should accept cases of reincarnation type and not accept cases of possession. And in that case, we are evolving in a very different world from the one you and I are accustomed to. A world in which consciousnesses can be incarnate or disincarnate. Then we who are incarnate, who have bodies, see each other's. Most of us do not see disincarnate consciousnesses. My mother-in-law does, for instance, quite common. It's quite embarrassing when my wife goes with her to the market, because my wife doesn't want to hear about this. And my mother-in-law never reports these cases. But sometimes when they have arrived, she says to me, "Oh, you know, we crossed so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so." Then disincarnate consciousnesses would perceive each other and might or might not perceive incarnate beings. This is very much the Buddhist worldview, the worldview of sentient beings. Sentient beings can have a body but do not necessarily have a body. Spirits are seen as beings like us, with the afflictions we have, the desires we have. Sometimes they interact with our world, and most of the times they do not. But I thought I would mention these cases to give you an idea of just how much of a paradigm shift has occurred in the West in the last 2 centuries. And as a result, if you yourselves are seriously interested in becoming Buddhists, what sort of a worldview you will be participating in? And you have to ask yourself, is this rational or not? For instance, in the case of the treatment of dissociative identity disorder, I think there's a strong case to be made that psychiatry has operated largely on the basis of bodies. I think the data is pretty much there. In the case of cases of the reincarnation type, which Stevenson presented, interestingly enough, these cases have never really been addressed by the scientific community at large. And nobody has ever questioned Stevenson's integrity or his methodology. When there have been 1 or 2 questions addressed to his methodology, he has actually tried to replicate the case. There have been replication studies. Then cases of near-death experience are starting to be well known in Western hospitals. I think they will occur with an increasing frequency, precisely because resuscitation is becoming more and more realistic in our clinical environment. Then it is my personal belief, as I mentioned to you yesterday, that we are in the middle of a paradigm shift. In physics, it has already occurred. In biology and medicine, certainly as far as near-death experiences are concerned, the data is piling up. It is going to have to be addressed at some point. Then paradigm shifts are resisted. There's nothing terribly surprising about that. Human beings don't like change. But as we will see this afternoon, the Indian religious traditions, which are somewhat between religions and philosophies in many senses of the term, are very compatible with the body of data which has come out so far. Then I have covered what I wanted to cover with you this morning. If you have questions, I'll be happy to take your questions. Please.
Thanks again for that presentation. I was interested, I smiled to myself when you said that quantum physics doesn't support Christianity, because I went to YouTube last night and I'm top-of-mind thing. There's what appears to be a very interesting extrapolation of quantum physics, and ends up the conclusion there is a God. But I'm more interested in the reincarnation aspects. One question is, I would ask, is why do most of the reincarnation cases seem to come from the third world and not from the Western world? I know one excuse is, one reason it's offered is that it's more acceptable in those communities, and people don't tend to speak out in Western communities for the fear of being ridiculed. However, my experience with small children is really it's not high on their agenda. They speak freely.
When you're talking, I'll go grab a cushion because it turns out the floor is not cool as I can get a solid board. My apologies. Thank you. Yes. Well, quantum mechanics can be invoked to support anything we want because nobody really understands what's happening. But the reason I said that quantum mechanics is basically very problematical for the monotheistic religious traditions we'll talk about this afternoon is that in traditional monotheistic philosophies, God is here and the world is there. God is immaterial and the world is material, created by God, and not dependent for its daily functioning on Him. And it exists, the world, as we know it, exists outside of us. Now, this is not the position of all Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions, or mystical traditions, which have a much more sympathetic view of the relationship between mind and matter. But overwhelmingly, this is the dominant viewpoint. Such a viewpoint is simply advanced quantum mechanics. The idea of a material world out there, independent of us, created by God, however long ago, which functions autonomously, independently of us, is something which is not supported, at least at the subatomic level. The monotheistic view of the world would be strongly compatible with Newtonian physics. Classical physics would be very happy with that. Now your second question, cases of the reincarnation type overrepresented in third world countries. Initially, certainly with Stevenson's research, I think it was simply a case of cultural openness to these memories in countries in which past lives are not as shocking as here. Jim Tucker has focused exclusively on Western cases. Then we now have a large number of very strong Western cases of memories of past lives. I've talked of at least one at TBI, one of the strongest Western cases I know. In these cases, we have all the features we encounter in the Burmese Thai cases. There's one particular case of a young child, an American child, recollecting a past life as a fighter pilot who fought in World War II. And this child actually manifested very shocking and disturbing behavior. His family was Baptist Christian family in Louisiana, so as you can imagine, reincarnation does not go down very well in those years. At the age of 2, the child started having recurrent nightmares. I forget his name, Chris, my apologies. Do you remember?
Yes, I'm just... I'll look it up.
It's gender wrong at all. I have it in my files. Chris will find it for us, I'm sure. And he started kicking his blankets off or shouting, "Plane on fire, little man must get up." Then these nightmares were recurrent. They occurred first weekly, then almost every night, driving the parents into a frenzy. And they tried to draw the child out.
Jack Leininger.
Yes, James Leininger. The case is very famous. When the little child started drawing, he exclusively drew pictures of planes on fire, propeller planes on fire, plunging towards what he drew as an ocean, and surrounded by flashes. Then, to try to disprove his wife's idea that perhaps these were memories of a past life, his wife had started to turn away from Baptist dogma in the capital. James Leininger's father decided to investigate his son's memory, just didn't think they were false. And thanks to the internet, he was able to verify the data the child provided. The child said that the planes he flew systematically veered in one direction. And indeed, it turns out that the Corsairs, which were the plane in question, systematically veered in one direction. And the child gave, James Leininger gave the name of the aircraft carrier he served upon, called the Natoma. Nobody had ever heard of it. And his father was eventually able to track it down. When the little boy was given toy soldiers, he gave them names which were in keeping with the names of his best friends in his previous life. And one of these best friends, he gave the full name of Jack Lawson. Eventually, the father was able to track down Jack Lawson, who met with the little boy, and who treated him exactly as his lost friend from World War II. The child also showed an extraordinary level of knowledge of how airplanes flew and airplane functioning, and eventually, with his parents, traveled to the site off the island of Okinawa, where his plane was shot down. Then, this is one of these cases. And it's a case which clearly shows why Stevenson had such problems getting such cases. A child was born in Louisiana, in a Baptist family, and literally everything possible was done to discourage such memories from emerging. The father was a prominent businessman. You know, America, especially the South, is profoundly religious. This would have been very harmful to the family status and maybe even to his business. While the father has eventually had to accept reincarnation, he remains a Christian, despite this. I hope that answers your question.
In part it does, because I think as the world becomes less religious, or the Western world, I would expect those constraints about talking about past experiences to...
No, I don't think so, not in the West, for a very simple reason. Memories of past lives are not normal. Stevenson's research shows that memories of past lives basically don't occur if the previous death was natural. They occur when the previous death was abrupt and violent. Now, everything is done in Western hospitals to draw out the death process. And death generally occurs under morphine. So in these cases, you would expect, assuming that the person who died under morphine had a human rebirth, which is highly improbable. From Buddhist timelines, we would expect an animal rebirth. But if that person had a human rebirth, we would assume that there would be no memories. Because it is, in a violent death, what happens is it is the dissolution of the coarse minds into the subtler minds which collapses. Then it seems that in this process, memories do pass over. They're not supposed to. It's not something which benefits the equilibrium of the child. No child who has had memories of past lives seems to have particularly benefited from these memories. If anything, it's often harmful. That's why Stevenson has always been opposed to hypnotic recollection of past lives. He does not view it as therapeutic. In my personal experience, I have regressed at least one patient, is that it's not therapeutic. It is stressful for the patient and not terribly helpful. Then Jim Tucker has pursued research in the field, that's basically constraining his research now is funding. And Stevenson has published one book, European Cases of the Reincarnation Type, you might find of interest, in which he focuses exclusively on Western cases. And the cases are strong. British cases, there are two twins, British twins, a very, very strong case. One German case, it's an older case of the 1920s, a German gentleman who had memories of a previous existence in the Middle Ages as a result of an acute bout of fever, and who was actually able to track down the castle he served in as a soldier, and had clear memories of the layout of the castle in the 1300s 14th century, the Catholic had been heavily modified since then, he was able to confirm the 13th century layout by investigating in the archives, which are very well kept. Then cases like these are very strong. So these cases are mentioned in European cases of the reincarnation type, and I would encourage all of you to investigate by yourselves.
I heard of one case where a young girl. I heard of one case where a young girl identified her killer. And the police, they actually found, because all the details she had about the person and where it happened and whatever, she couldn't have known, and they slowly tracked it down and they eventually caught the murderer and he got caught. So,
I don't know the case, but it does happen.
yeah.
Like in the case of the Turkish case we mentioned,
Yeah.
if Isa Dikbeli had not been arrested, I'm quite sure the police would have looked at him very carefully, because that young boy was making a strong case,
That's what happened here too.
a very strong case.
And the other thing is in the automatic writing thing, I recently watched a documentary on A Course in Miracles, so that was all written by automatic writing. So,
Automatic writing is an open question. I don't take position either way. I think there's a lot of automatic writing which is a product of the person. But there are also cases which are puzzling, and these Brazilian psychographers are puzzling cases. That I didn't insist on it too much. I wanted to insist on the very strong cases of possession, Stevenson list. But what I would very much like to do, and some of you I think are more sympathetic to the viewpoint, some are not, I would like to encourage you to stretch a little bit your minds. Not everything you are told in school is true.
right.
And not everything which is orthodox dogma is true. Some is. But when it is quite clear that orthodox dogma is basically doing loops to try to account for phenomena, you are entitled to look elsewhere. And there's quite a pile-up of data, as you can see already in the last day and a half. There's strong data from physics. I mean, it's theoretical data. It's very difficult to refute from one's position. And evidence corroborating his view is building up. Then there is evidence from a lot of diverse fields. We don't have a clear account of altruism in biology, especially when it comes to primate altruism. We have no account of the fact that children can actually learn to speak. The poverty of stimulus argument, nobody indicates they shouldn't be able to. Then we have no account for the pubertal ethical sense, which Bloom and his team put in evidence among children aged 3 to 6 months at Yale. Okay, where does this come from? Then, as I mentioned yesterday, there is strong data supporting the existence of telepathy. I mean, from a series of different sources, Russian sources, American sources, data strong enough that basically it's been taken on board by the military. There is substantial data about PSK, about psychokinesis. Then we saw today that there is a growing body of data regarding near-death experiences indicating that they do occur during cardiac arrest. And the counter argument is that somehow they would occur before or after. The person recollects them as occurring during, which is nice and fine, but those who say that provide no evidence whatsoever that they occur before or after. It's a prejudice. A prejudice is this. A prejudice means that without data, you advance a position because this is your theoretical framework. You have no data to support it. There's no data to support this viewpoint. And then verified cases of near-death experience where the person knows something they're not supposed to know are not accountable for the present paradigm. Cases of reincarnation type, we have 895 verified cases unaccountable for. And in my opinion, and this is my private opinion, perhaps because I lived many years in Asia and come from a background which is not completely Western in many senses of the term, certain psychiatric ailments really are not well accounted for in psychiatry. that the traditional account is just much more convincing. Do you have any questions before we separate for lunch? Yes, please.
Possibly you can speak about this afternoon, so I might be a bit preemptive. Regarding possession, what would, in Buddhist theory, the mechanism be for possession? Because it seems like, say, a person who then becomes possessed by another does not go through a reincarnation cycle, and neither does the spirit die and be reborn in that body. It seems like they sort of transition between bodies. So what is your personal thoughts on this, on the mechanism?
I can give you my personal viewpoint. It's not been analysed in depth in Buddhism. Then there are some analyses at the tantric level which I cannot enter into here. But basically, there's two possibilities. Either the person has died, in other words, consciousness has left the body and another consciousness comes in. Or the person has not died and two consciousnesses coexist with one neural substrate. These are the two possibilities. Now, the first possibility is quite straightforward. The person dies. It's probably what happened with Sumi.
Yeah, when there's one change and then
Person dies, then that body is still physiologically functional for a couple of minutes, and a spirit basically takes over the body and animates it. And then normally the previous personality never returns. It's like a house has become empty because someone moved out. Someone else moves in and that's it. And the other case is where the squatter wants to live with you. Then this would imply a sharing of the neural substrate. And I think this goes a long way to explain why, in full cases of possession, the two personalities don't manifest simultaneously.
But would birth occur?
Birth.
So say person A is the person who was born by mum, dad, whatever, and then when the second personality comes in, person B, that person B would be taking rebirth in that other body simultaneously, or it's just occupying it for a little while?
It doesn't seem to be a rebirth.
Yeah.
If it was a rebirth, then person B, the spirit, would have to go through the body and would have to...
It would be there permanently.
Yes. It doesn't seem to be a rebirth, but frankly, we don't know.
Yeah.
The cases I have heard of, it's not a rebirth.
Yeah.
Then what you do see in the cases I have personally encountered is in many cases there's a certain nebulousness. It is unclear whether foot possession has occurred or not. And you see a very distinct change in personal habits. It's quite striking. One case I know of quite well, someone who is a non-smoker and never drinks, always smokes and drinks when possessed. Then this old friend of mine, when possessed, has clear and very strong paranormal powers, which I personally verified, of the nature of telepathy. So he could describe someone whom he had never seen and whom I had never met, but had just seen a photo of. And what he described, without our meeting, was in keeping with the picture. That when I met this third party, his description was not in keeping with the third party. So it seems to provide clear evidence that he had access to a mental image in my mind, but did not have access to the reality of the other person. A very clear case over thousands of kilometers. Then I can only encourage you yourselves to make your own experiences. I know this is quite threatening for quite a few people. You are moving into a very different universe, very different from the one you're accustomed to. And the suggestion I would make is to go slowly. Don't stretch yourself more than is necessary. But I think what I feel I can say in all fairness is that our modern Western hear the Tibetans say very frequently privately, is very Bosantopa. It's very narrow-minded. People's minds are so small, it's just frightening, you know. Nothing exists out of matter, and then obviously whenever the person comes face to face with something which is completely incompatible with his viewpoint, they run away screaming. They run away screaming. Then we don't want you to run away screaming, right? So, I think this is pretty much it for this morning. We'll reconvene this afternoon. This afternoon, we will start trying to draw all this together, make a synthesis, and see how this is linked to Indian schools of thought, and how this might be linked to Buddhist teachings. Thank you very much.
You beat me to it. So, yes, lunch should be served shortly, and